think we're in business.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's workshop, Hyperspectral Imagery, What is it and what is it for? We're here today with Stewart from Wyvern. Just a few ground rules before we get started. If you have any questions, feel free to use the chat function. Please keep yourself on mute, and this workshop will be recorded, so feel free to come back to it when you're working over the weekend, especially if you're working on one of the Wyvern challenges. So this presentation, What is Hyperspectral Imagery and what is it used for, is being brought to us by Stewart from Wyvern. Chris is a data scientist working on image processing pipelines. He got even more interested in space after doing a previous Space Apps challenge and decided to get into the space tech sector not long after. This workshop will give an intro to multispectral and hyperspectral imagery, what they are, where to find some data sources, and a few example uses of these types of imagery. So I'll pass it off to Chris and we'll get started. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, thanks for that intro, Kelly. So we'll just jump right into it. As Kelly mentioned, this is all about hyperspectral imagery. And so if you hadn't heard of it before, hopefully this will give you kind of a nice intro into what it is and where to find some of it. And if you have heard of it before, then hopefully you might learn a few things or see some interesting stuff. So yeah, I'll just give like a quick introduction about a bit about Wyvern and a bit about myself before diving into the main topic about what is hyperspectral imagery and where to find it, and then some neat examples of how it can be used. So just a little bit about Wyvern to start. So we're actually a space tech startup, started in 2018 out west in Alberta in Edmonton. And basically our whole vision is to be able to provide actionable intelligence from space anywhere in the solar system to really help enable a sustainable future for humanity. So bold vision, but we're hard at work trying to make that happen. With that, we're on track to launch our first satellite in kind of first quarter 2022, so super exciting. And then we have another technology demonstrator satellite planned for 2023. And so really kind of our advantage is that basically with a satellite the size of like a loaf of bread, like a CubeSat, we can do what used to take a satellite the size of a car. So a huge reduction in the size. And with that, it really opens up accessibility to this space data for everyone. So if any of that sounds exciting, we're also hiring. So go check out our website, wyvern.space. So a bit about myself. As Kelly mentioned, I'm a data scientist here at Wyvern. My background is in various types of engineering, but actually I worked in the healthcare sector for a few years before kind of being lured into space. And really kind of that's the one fun fact. I did the Space Apps hackathon last year in 2020, and that kind of really made me realize working with like satellite data and stuff, like, hey, this is just data. Like you don't need to be a PhD in astrophysics to do this stuff and to be in space. So that's super cool, and I hope you guys find some cool and exciting things out of this hackathon as well. But yeah, so at Wyvern, I'm working on building our satellite image processing pipeline. So what that is basically how you go from the raw data of the satellite and actually all the processing and stuff that it takes to turn it into a usable finished image at the end. So kind of with that, we'll get into actually what are those images? What is hyperspectral imagery? But first I'm going to take a little bit step back and say, what is normal imagery? So basically our human eyes and most typical cameras can detect light in three bands or colors, red, blue, and green, or RGB, as you probably heard. And in order to kind of do that, I have a little diagram here. So you can see this is sort of a typical camera sensor. Basically, light bounces off of an object that you're taking an image of, and it enters the camera sensor like through a bunch of lenses and stuff. And then it'll strike the image sensor here. So this kind of gray thing. And these image sensors have a kind of a filter layer on top. So this type of filter is called a Bayer filter, and it's this cool little sort of mosaic checker pattern you see there. And essentially what that does is each of those kind of filters on a pixel only lets light of a certain wavelength through. So naturally the blue filters let only blue light through, green lets green through. And so when you kind of take an image, you're left with sort of these three kind of interesting patterns. You can kind of see down here in the corner. It's a little small. And then you have to do some processing to basically reconstruct the image that you or I would see with our eyes. So you have to basically do a little bit of interpolation to figure out like some of these missing pixels in between for all the different colors. And then that kind of gets you to having sort of three sets of images, if you will, or three bands. Your red, your green, and your blue. And then when you combine those all and show them on a screen, it looks like a normal color image. So then moving on to like hyperspectral or multispectral, they're kind of similar but slightly different. They work a little bit differently. Instead of just capturing three bands, multispectral can capture kind of anywhere from like 4 to 15 bands per image, and hyperspectral can capture up to like hundreds of bands. So you're really getting like a whole big chunk of the spectrum instead of just those three colors. And this lets you kind of do a lot more because there's a lot of information in those extra bands. And there's a few different types of hyperspectral sensors, but we'll kind of talk about one sort of common one, and that's called like a line scan, or a push broom is sort of the fun name. And basically how that works is instead of having kind of this mosaic of filters and you're capturing like the whole image at once, you actually have these filters kind of arrayed like this on the top right. So one row of pixels is filtering just for one sort of color or band. And then basically the imager only captures kind of one sort of slice of the ground at a time. So you can kind of see down here, it captures, again, light comes in, reflects, and it actually is passed through this little slit that restricts it to like a very narrow field of view. And then it goes through some optics magic and some diffraction, and those wavelengths get split out and projected onto the image sensor through those filters. So for each basically kind of little slit or row of pixels on the ground, you're capturing one row of every single band that your sensor is set up to capture. And then that doesn't really give you an image, that just gives you one little slit. If you actually want like a whole picture, you kind of have to rely on the fact that the camera is moving. So it kind of works like a scanner or like a photocopier, if like you heard of those things or that they're still around, or a push broom. You can kind of think of it like that, like a big wide broom kind of pushing along the ground. And as it moves along the ground, you're capturing like each of these little slices and building up like arrays of these wavelength information. And then basically you kind of need to do the same thing. You need some image processing to take like all of the rows of red pixels or infrared or whatever band it is and put them back together to get like a whole sort of two-dimensional image. And yeah, you can see here, like you can have up to hundreds of bands. So you can have a really big swath of the spectrum all the way out into kind of colors that humans can't see. So you can go all the way out into infrared and further. So yeah, just some kind of considerations that if you're working with hyperspectral data, you probably want to know a little bit about it. So it often comes in two forms, either radiance. So that's really, you can think it like the sun's energy is coming in and the ground and stuff is reflecting or emitting or transmitting that light. So it's radiating it back out into space, and that can be picked up by the satellite. Or the other possibly more common one that you'll come across is reflectance. And you can really think of this as like a percentage. So it's basically what percentage of light is reflected or emitted, transmitted, compared to how much incident light came in. And so it's a 1 to 0 number, or you can think of it like a percentage. Yeah, and that's kind of nice because it removes any like sort of distortion or or different timings and lighting effects. Like if you're taking pictures at different times of the day, the sun angles will be different and stuff like that. So that nicely controls for some of those. Yeah, and reflectance, you'll probably come across that more if you have like, it's called analysis ready data. So this is sort of data that's been processed to a higher level and is more ready for your kind of exciting analysis or to feed into machine learning models or whatever you kind of want to do with it. And when working with that data, it's often kind of referred to as like a hyperspectral data cube. So yeah, basically this cool kind of picture on the right here shows sort of that thing. So for each kind of layer, that'll be like one of your bands that you've captured. So we can see here, it's like an image. It looks like the coast. We've got some water and some kind of like lush green here. But you'll have that like every single band. This is actually like a false color image. So it's combining some of the bands together to show some of that information. But you can see here how like you can go through all the different bands and they'll all kind of have a bit different information because they're all different wavelengths that were captured. Yeah, so now that we've kind of talked a bit about hyperspectral data, where can we find it? So here are three kind of good sources of it. These are not like the only three sources, like you can find other ones, other pretty good ones, but these three are kind of nice to work with if you've never kind of worked with hyperspectral data before, or they have some pretty good quality data. So there's the Avaris instrument. This is NASA JPL designed this instrument. There's NEON actually has their own data set as well. And then there's the Sentinel mission by the European Space Agency. They're actually multispectral, so not quite as many bands, but they have a global coverage, sorry, which is nice. So you can kind of get imagery from anywhere in the world. Yeah, so as I kind of mentioned, the Avaris and NEON, those are just available in North America, but ESA's Sentinel mission has like a global coverage. So depending on kind of what you're thinking for your idea or your challenge, maybe you just need to look at like some certain specific areas in North America, or maybe you want to look at a bunch of different places across the world. So that might inform your decision. In terms of resolution, Avaris and NEON are like 1 meter to 17 meters. Avaris is actually captured on an airplane, not a satellite. So that's why it can vary more depending on how high or low the airplane happens to be flying. That'll change the resolution. NEON is set at 1 meter, and Sentinel is a bit special because it captures different bands at different resolutions. So it has resolutions at 10, 20, and 60 meters, and like specific bands for each of those. In terms of like the spectral ranges, so Avaris and NEON are really quite similar because NEON secretly uses kind of the same sensor. They're 380 to kind of 2500 nanometers, so pretty wide swath of the spectrum. And again, as I mentioned, like Sentinel is a bit special. It has different kind of wavelengths for its different resolutions. So you kind of have to look at what wavelengths you want and what resolutions you need, and kind of do a little bit of picking and choosing there with Sentinel. In terms of the number of bands, Avaris has 224. NEON has a whopping 426, so all the bands you could ever want. And Sentinel has 4 bands at 10 meters, 6 bands at 20 meters, and 3 bands at 60 meters. Yeah, and then just down here is like the links to basically go get all of that data. So it's all free and like open source, which is pretty nice. So you can go and check out their websites. They're pretty good. They've got like a lot of resources for like talking about the data and like how to use it and some cool examples and things like that. So those are all neat. And then if you want, there's one kind of extra little data source out here, and basically open data areas. So Alberta did a kind of initiative to thoroughly map like a few specific regions in Alberta. And they didn't just collect like hyperspectral data, they collected like LiDAR and like ground sampling, a whole bunch of like pretty cool things too. So if you wanted to do some Alberta specific data, maybe for one of the Wyvern challenges, if you guys want to pursue those. There's another source to check out for you. Yeah, so finally, we'll kind of chat about some of the cool example uses of hyperspectral data. So kind of the first one here is agriculture. So this is really what Wyvern's quite heavily focused on. Because of all that extra information you capture with hyperspectral imagery, you can see a lot of stuff that you can't see with a normal like RGB image. And this is really great as it enables something we call like precision agriculture. So you can really take an image of some farms or some cropland and detect things like plant health, like if there's disease or soil quality, and like the plant stress and things like that, and actually say like, hey, like this part of your field is not doing so great, or this part's doing really well. So farmers can kind of tailor their uses of fertilizer and pesticides and things like that far more precisely than just kind of blanketing the whole field. So this really can cut down on the use of some of those. Yeah, and then you can do some cool things like characterizing the type of plants, or even detecting like invasive species and things like that. So we can see some cool like false color imagery, hyperspectral imagery of some like cropland here. There's like a river running through it, and you can see all the little fields and things like that. So kind of how these images are made is they'll take like a few select bands depending on what they're looking for, and they'll kind of put them together because our computer screens can only really show red, blue, and green. So some of these, like the purples, maybe they took like the infrared band and like showed that as red, but then there's like another band in there too. So a bunch of different stuff. Another one possible use case is mineral detection. So again, it's really interesting that kind of each sort of element has a spectral signature. So they kind of reflect or emit or absorb light in their own special way. So when you take a hyperspectral image of an area, you can actually break down those signatures and figure out like the individual kind of components, and you can tell what stuff is made of. So naturally, this is super useful for like prospecting or mining. You can take a satellite photo of an area, and if you've done some good calibration and maybe taken some ground samples to sort of ground truth it, you can then do like classification, as you can kind of see in the images here where they sort of detected what the area is made of. So looking for kind of mining deposits or things like that. Finally, kind of the last quick example I'll talk about here is environmental monitoring or studying sort of ecological health. So again, because you can tell what things are made of and you can assess like plant health and things like that, that's super useful for monitoring the environment. And you can see here, this is sort of one example. I believe this is kind of the northwest side of North America. So maybe like North California, Washington State, maybe a bit of BC in there. And you can actually see, because hyperspectral imagery has bands into the infrared, it can detect heat. So you can pick out basically fires or these hot spots that are kind of marked in red here. You can see the smoke trails, so you can kind of get an idea where they are, but this really lets you kind of see and track those ones, especially with maybe smaller ones which aren't visible on normal imagery yet. Yeah, so that's super useful for, say, like early detection forest fires or things like that. Yeah, and then you can detect other stuff like algae blooms or oil spills or kind of all sorts of things. It's sort of up to your imagination and what data you can get and if you can sort of calibrate and classify it. Yeah, so I went through that really quick, but happy to take some questions now.
Great, thank you, Chris. So I'm just keeping an eye on the chat here, and we do have a few questions. And so our first question was related to one of your slides when you were talking about working with the data, that hyperspectral data comes in two forms. And you talked about, you didn't use the word reflective, and now I can't remember, radiance and reflectance. And so the question was, so, you know, to use layman's terms, is that radiation and light?
Yeah, you can think about radiance is basically radiation. It's kind of photons being emitted or reflected from the ground or whatever material you're imaging. So here's the units down here. It's in watts per stereo-radian per meter squared per nanometer, which sounds pretty complicated, but it's really basically just for a certain area of ground. There's kind of incoming radiation, or like light photons are a form of radiation. And they're either kind of being absorbed or reflected or kind of transmitted by the ground, depending on what that material is made of. And then the satellite is up in space, or it could be on a plane, can pick that up.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. There was another question about the use case for precision agriculture. So how does hyperspectral data provide insights into disease, which I think you mentioned? Yeah, so assessing the plant health. So disease detection, how does that work?
Yeah, so again, it comes back to sort of what different bands are being reflected. So healthy plants will actually absorb a lot of red light or bands in the red kind of region, and they'll reflect a lot of infrared light. So when your plants are nice and green and healthy, you'll kind of get one sort of spectral signature. But then if they get sick from like a disease, or if they're stressed or it's too hot or something like that, that will actually change. So like the plant's color will change, they might go yellow, and they'll also start reflecting different light. So they'll actually absorb a lot more infrared light. And so there's actually a metric, I believe it's called like NDVI. It's like the something vegetation index. And that's basically like the ratio of kind of the absorbed red light versus infrared. So if you basically measure that, you can see if a plant is healthy or not.
Very good, thank you. I think this question came in maybe when you were talking about the mining use case. And the question was, does this process require quantum mechanics or something that is built up on quantum mechanics?
So I'm not a quantum physicist, but essentially it is, yeah, I guess it is related to quantum mechanics, because for a certain material, you're having photons of light strike it, and some will be reflected and some will actually be absorbed and then re-emitted as different kind of, or photons of a different wavelength. So I believe that's like a quantum effect. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but
I'm also not a quantum physicist either, so we'll call that a correct answer. And then a follow-on question. So when you talk about being able to understand and classify mineral deposits, would you be able to tell what's inside an asteroid?
Maybe not like deep inside at the center, but certainly at the surface. Yes, I believe so. And they've actually used this on like other bodies too. So like the Perseverance rover has a little laser. I don't know if you kind of know this, and like a spectrograph, like a actual spectral camera, and it'll zap kind of rocks that they find interesting. And that little puff of like vaporized rocks, they'll image that. They can tell what it's made of. And on the moon as well, like we've had satellites that have gone and done kind of spectral imaging and been able to detect like water ice, like just kind of in the soil, a little bit below the surface, not like deep down, like kilometers down, but you can definitely tell kind of what's on the surface or close to it.
That's a great answer, thank you. And the last question is, and there's a question of whether this is in the public domain, but are we able to use hyperspectral data and leverage it to detect dark matter and dark energy?
That's a really good question. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know a ton about dark matter. I haven't really come across any kind of use cases for using hyperspectral to detect dark matter. As far as I know, it's kind of like a very mysterious and very hard to detect thing. Yeah, so I'm sorry, that's kind of a non-answer. I don't really know. If you do kind of read up on that and find out though, that'd be interesting. Let me know.
Okay, we will for sure. I don't see any other questions in the chat, so I think we did a reasonable job of putting you through the paces. But thank you very much for the presentation. if you can send us your slides, I'd like to make those available in addition to the recording. And so we can post that in the CAN Waterloo Space Apps channel. And thanks everyone for joining us. And many thanks to you, Chris, for your presentation this evening and for sharing your time with us.
Yeah, thank you all. And we have actually a little cheat sheet with kind of like a SparkNotes version of this too. So I'll share the slides, and I believe that cheat sheet's available on the Slack as well. And we have another guy from Wyvern, awesome guy, Evan, who's around as well mentoring. So go say hi to him. Yeah, but thank you all.
Yes, thanks very much. Okay, thank you everyone. Enjoy your hacking.
Happy hacking.
Happy hacking.